Okay. So throughout today, we're going to be talking a lot about some very basic fundamentals about the software. It'll be less practical in the sense that we're not going to be building actually an object yet. Really, we're going to be studying the grid and how the grid behaves, because what you need to understand is the mathematical system within which this particular program is going to operate. How have any of you used AutoCAD like way back when? Probably not, right? But like 10 years ago? Okay, never mind. I won't go there. So what we're going to kind of touch on a little bit more here is really truly understanding the Cartesian coordinate system and how that's going to also apply to numbers and lists, which is more of a programming terminology in this particular software. So when I say the Cartesian coordinate system, raise your hand if you know what I'm referring to. Okay, so it happens all the time. Don't feel discouraged or anything. So let me show this off real fast. All right. So when I draw this, does that look familiar to any of you? Right, so it's from your math classes, it's from trig, it's from geometry. This is essentially the 4 quadrants of the Cartesian coordinate system. And most particularly for us right now, this is in the XY plane. What that means is that at the same time, you have your positive in the first quadrant. You also have, and I'm going to draw this sort of at an angle, so if you've ever done any kind of illustration, you might understand what I mean by this, but this one is essentially your z-axis. So if you're looking at it in 2 dimensions, you've got x and y, and then it's actually coming out this way, but I'm trying to illustrate it in projection. We'll talk about that, I guess, at some point if necessary. But anyway, this is your z-plane. And the z-plane happens perpendicular to the xy plane. So when you look at the perspective view and your top, front, and right side views, you see the 3 different axes here illustrated for you. Right, so is that brand new to anyone? Okay, so I like to refresh on this because I know that we all know it, but I like to refresh on this and put a little diagram up on the board so that you can actually physically see it, because when we're developing things in this program, even when you're modeling them, you might tell it 5 feet to the right or 5 feet to the left, but it's adapting what you're telling it to be more intuitive when you're just building it in Rhino. So I could put something here and then move my mouse off this way, type in 5 feet, and it'll go 5 feet that way. I can anchor a line here and I could type it that way and say 5 feet that way. But I've already given it a direction, and so it has to ignore the negatives. The difference with Grasshopper is that you don't really have that luxury. You have to know where your static origins are at all points. Okay, so I'm just prefacing what we're going to run into with the grid. So let's drop something in and start just kind of looking at how it behaves. Where did that go? Where did that go? There it is. So another thing I do with this, since we unfortunately only have one screen on these computers, is you kind of have to like squeeze it into this half screen situation, which is really unfortunate. We should have dual screens, but I oftentimes will go side by side, and then I don't always use this, and these workspaces are completely useless like that, so I'll just kind of grab that one usually and pull it over or something like that. Okay, so we at least get to see a little bit of the workspace, some of the tools, and then we've got a pretty good I'll call it a sketch pad. So I said that we're going to be working with a grid. So a grid is basically going to be set up with, four-sided cells, right? So every space in a grid is called a cell. And when you drop in, like we did before, we dropped in a sphere. Notice how it actually, it gets placed at the origin, right? So that's the 0, 0, 0 point for all of these right there. But it also has, and it shows you a grid. And that's important because basically any of the geometry that you create in Grasshopper is going to have a grid. And anytime that you manipulate that geometry into other bits and pieces, they all have an inherent grid as well. Okay, so sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't, but just be aware that it's there. So now, going back into, where am I? Vector. So under the Vector tab, you'll notice that there's an entire panel that's dedicated to grids. And if you open it up, you'll notice that there are 5 primary different types of grids. And then there are grids of chaos. So it's basically populate 2D and 3D and populate geometry. The most basic form is pretty much going to be your square grid, and that's the one we're going to work with right now. So if you could go down to the square node and drop that into your workspace. Okay, so let's take a look at, and before I move forward, let's just kind of take a look at the node. I don't know yet how many different display features Jeff introduced to you in your introductory assignment, but basically what it says is SQ grid. And that's pretty descriptive, but like I said in my intro on Monday, sometimes they can be extremely misleading, particularly with the fact that, if you look up here, it doesn't say SQ grid. But it also has an icon which sort of tells you a little bit about it. You could hover over everything if you want, but if you want things to be contiguous, you can go to the display pull down and turn on draw icons, and it'll show you the icon that you're looking for in your toolbars. Typically what I do is I usually leave them off. I tend to like the description here. It's up to you. Sometimes I work one way, sometimes I work the other way. But I will say that it is possible where you have multiple elements, so I'm just going to drop a few in real fast. So if you've got a bunch on here and they're all set to show your descriptive title, you can actually change just one of them. I forget where that was again. Oh, yeah, that's right. So you can actually just change one of them right here with the little paint bucket tool right there, and it'll change it to either the name or the icon. Additionally, if you are so inclined and you get really irritated with what these tools are being titled, you can actually right-click it and change it. So I can right-click it, and at the top, and the same goes for almost any node, it'll have a little titling bar, and you can call it square grid, or whatever you want to call it. So that becomes very important once you have very, very long definitions. So just so you know it's there. So I'm going to go back to SQ grid. And just for your reference, and something that I found to be extremely useful in learning this software, understanding the relationship of tracking its organization in the panels up top. What I do is if you select one of these things, if you select one of the nodes, you can hit Control G, and it makes it what's called a group. So I'll drop a few more on so that you can see that if it's multiples, it groups them into a box. And you can select that box and pull it around. But most importantly, for my purposes right now, I can right-click that box, and I can actually trace where that information came from. So for me, this particular node came from vector, the vector tab, and the grid panel. So what I'll be doing for you guys throughout the semester is titling where the origin of these nodes is. Okay, so sometimes I'll pause in the middle of the session, tutorial to do that for you so that you don't get completely lost. Okay, so what questions do you have on that so far?
What kind of grade is not square complete? What is the difference? The shape has it.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand you.
The grid you make it, what is not complete squares? Different.
That?
Yeah.
Why is it not square?
Yeah, it's not complete square. It has the one so extra. It's kind of like it.
That's a good question, and we'll stop the video on that one. But so basically, remember how we put the sphere in, and the sphere had a grid? Well, in this particular case, the grid has a grid.
Oh.
So it's mostly so that you know what plane the grid is in. Because sometimes you have three-dimensional geometry that defines your grid. And so if you have it flat on the XY plane, you need to know that it's flat on the XY plane. Versus if you tilt it upward, that grid is going to show you that it's been tilted upward, even if your geometry maybe is twisted around. You'll see what I mean later on. But yeah.